Yeah. So I remember just doing that. I don't know. Yes, this is such a kind of joke. No. Oh, it's just a feedback. Okay, good morning.
Morning.
And welcome to our fourth and last class about is based on how God uses the book of Revelation to preserve his church in Spain through times of oppression. We are going to start this class as we have frequently in the past by singing together, and if you could stand with me to do that, Jerusalem the Golden, hymn written by Bernard of Cluny, who figures prominently not just in terms of writing a hymn that we start our class with, but he's also part of the narrative in this morning's class. So let's sing together this hymn, Jerusalem Golden, looking forward to that vision given to us by God through the Apostle John in the book of Revelation.
Jerusalem at the fold, and with me left, beneath your contemplation, sing heart and voice of praise. I know not all thy ways, but joys when they must be, what radiance he of glory. What bliss beyond compare? They sang those halls of sound, all jubilant with song, and brightly filled. I draw forth all the praises ever. Praise for me. The pastures of the blessed are kept in glory. It is not all nothing, and they will praise some song of the throne. The shouts of better things, and they will render their Lord and God. Sings the blessed country, all the earth, all sweet and blessed, she happy. She's hot and blessing, sing timeless, glory, God of all, and spirit fed.
Amen. You see the please. Here we are at the end of our course. I'm not going to review because it's there in front of you in the description of what we've covered in the first 3 weeks. I have, as we got closer to what's going to happen in the Reconquista, or this recovery of the church and driving out the Moors, I amplified that a little bit to show us 4 different aspects that I'd like to address. We'd like to look at the Austerian initiation in driving the Muslims south. They're placed very close to the northern border on the Atlantic. Secondly, or B, we'll look at the support that the Spanish rulers received from the Frankish kingdom. Charlemagne, in particular, is the the head of the Frankish kingdom at that time. We'll also look at the significance of the Camino del Santiago de Compostela, the discovery of St. James the Apostle's bones on the northwest section of the Spain, and that became a pilgrimage route. And last, we'll look at the influence of the Benedictine Reformed Order of Cluny. That was Cluny being a small town in the middle of France in Burgundy, but becomes an important center of spiritual renewal within the Benedictine rule, which with Charlemagne's support had become sort of the dominant monastic order throughout all of Europe that is under Charlemagne and the Frankish rule. So that's our purpose. Now, I have to admit, in preparing this class, A, B, C, D of these categories, these are aspects of the Reconquista, and not to be confused, which I was confused by beginning with A, B, C, D, in showing the chronological sequence of this movement of the reconquest of Spain. So A is the 8th century, B is the 9th century, C is the 10th, D the 11th, and so on. So these I had to straighten out my head, so I hope I haven't confused you, but the first A, B, C, D in our outline of the class is aspects or content, and these are chronological. So you'll find some of that chronological content spread throughout all of these. And so the first of these, in terms of content, is the Asturian initiation. And if I can get the cursor to visually, is that showing up for you?
Yes.
This is Asturias up here. At least a portion of that, a couple Cantabria and a couple other, but that's the area within the 8th century. That's the restriction where the Muslims never gained control. That always remained in Spanish and Christian hands. And we're not going to dwell on the battles, but this is on the PowerPoint that I presume all of you received. If you want to go into the battle campaigns. But maybe just in pointing out that one of the victories outside of Spain, as we mentioned before, is the further advance of the Muslim armies were defeated by Charles Martel at Poitiers, and that is on the map right up here. So with that, we'll go on to a second aspect of this Asturian initiation, and that is Beatus condemns adoptionism. Last week, Barb Schumacher asked a very good question, which I tried to answer on the spot, but perhaps inadequately. She asked, were any of the Christians persecuted for resisting? Were they brought to a court for refusing to pay the monies, the tax that the Muslims imposed upon the Christians? And I said I wasn't aware of any example of that, but thinking about it further, and I mentioned this to her when I saw her that night, that tax, and I might have been misleading by calling it a tax on the Christians, it was also a tax on anyone who wasn't a Muslim, including the Jews. So it was a tax of a conquering kingdom, much like in Jesus' time, Levi was despised, as we read in Gospel of Luke this morning, not because he was despised because he was a traitor. He was collecting taxes for the Romans, betraying his own people. The Romans didn't ask the Hebrew people to become worshiping Roman gods at that point. So that tax was, and Jesus said, pay unto Caesar what Caesar is due, pay unto God what God is due. So Levi was despised by his own people, and why would Christ, and Calvin says quite clearly that Christ would call a taxpayer who was greedy, take more money than he can, and he was also traitorous. doing things for the Romans instead of respecting his own people. So that's the situation in Spain. It's a political tax more than it's a religious tax. Those that were persecuted, the 58 martyrs of Cordoba, they were persecuted for two reasons: for um, apostasy or blasphemy. If a child was born to a mixed marriage family, either mother or father being Muslim, the expectation would be that the child is a Muslim by Muslim law. If that child, when he or she matures, professes Christian faith, she would be called apostate. He would be called apostate, and they were sentenced to death by beheading. If as happened during that period when the 58 martyrs of Cordoba were executed, these were ones who came forward to a council or Islamic judge to say that they wanted to profess, the implication was they wanted to profess faith in Muhammad so that they might have the privilege of not being taxed and also positions in the government. And then when they got there, as we mentioned, they said Muhammad was an adulterer, a bigamist, and a liar, and those that follow him are going to hell. So they were clearly, setting themselves to have their heads off. But they wanted to make it clear, and these were mostly clerics or monks that were taking the lead, but also, as we've heard and saw, there were normal professing Christians that followed them. So, it's interesting that Beatus of Libana, who we've celebrated because of his writing this commentary, compiling this commentary on Revelation, we saw the beautiful images. He was also not just, he was a theologian to the heart and a defender of the faith. So that when adoptionism, Iberian adoptionism, sprang up in the Umayyad and Christian-held regions of Spain in the 8th and 9th centuries, this seems to have begun with the claim of the Archbishop Elipandas of Toledo. In respect to his human nature, Christ was the adoptive Son of God. That when Christ was just a man like the rest of us, but when he was baptized in the Holy Spirit and God's approbation on him came down, the suggestion was, "This is my beloved Son, whom I am well pleased, in whom I am well pleased." That's when Christ became God's Son. He was adopted. And a bright theologian that Beatus was, he immediately recognized that was promptualizing the biblical understanding that would have been formulated in the Nicene Creed. So he actually wrote to Alcuin, who was the clerk for Charlemagne, giving a heads up, this is going awry here. People are falling back into a non-Trinitarian understanding, understanding of Christ that's inconsistent with the Trinity, making him less than God the Father. So, writing to Charlemagne's court, quickly this was called to a council in Frankfurt, and it was condemned as heresy. So on to the second aspect of content that we wanted to cover, Frankish support. Obviously, right there's an indication of how that Frankish support might come. After that incident occurred, where Alcuin brought it to the court of Charlemagne, that the adoptionist issue was compromising the integrity of the creedal statement of the church. That's when he had earlier made petitions. That is, the Asturian kings had earlier made petitions to Charlemagne for support in this effort to drive the Muslims out. Those were pretty much rebuffed by Charlemagne until this episode occurred, and then Charlemagne acknowledged the Asturian king, endorsed and acknowledged the Asturian leader to be the king. And so that right away gave some impetus to that there's more than just these Asturian kings. Charlemagne himself is on that. And that didn't just be a verbal endorsement. Charlemagne's son, Louis the Pious, became a co-emperor with his father in 813. But he was also the king given rule over Aquitaine, which is the southern part of France, and charged with defending that southwest border. And if you look at this little map from the first one that we put up here, you see this green area. That's the portion, and the horizontal stripe with the orange and the orange beneath it, that would be the Pyrenees Mountains. And so, even though defeated at Poitiers by Louis the Pious' great-great-grandfather, Charles Martel, the Muslims were driven further south, but they still controlled this green area on the French side of the Pyrenees Mountains. And so in 801, Louis the Pious took it upon himself to drive the Muslims further south past the Pyrenees and actually went as far as Barcelona. Is that on this map? Yes, it is. They were driven as far south as Barcelona. And in the treaty to conclude this war, the Asturian king said, "Thank you for liberating this section from Muslim domination. But, you can go back to France. Thank you very much." In other words, they recognized that this effort on the part of Charlemagne and Louis the Pious was not just a religious victory, but it was also a political advance. And they kind of said, we like what you've done in terms of preserving the faith down here, but we're not sure we want you to become territorially involved in our country. So that's an issue. Is it the church or is it the king, the kingly power that's taking control here? And with this kind of Frankish support, the Asturian kings began to build Oviedo as their capital. And as you can see, this is a church that we actually saw when we talked about the number of martyrs that were celebrated in number of martyrs that occurred in the early period when the gospel came to Spain. We saw a number of martyrs there. The three of the earliest seven evangelists were martyred, and they recognize that from the book of Revelation, martyrs are very much honored, crying out before the throne of God, "How long, O Lord?" And so this was one of those churches that we looked at first class period, which is dedicated to some Egyptian martyrs from the early days of the church. And but now it's showing us an example of how the Asturian kings began to build up their capital with churches. Now they recognize themselves as the leaders in this Christian movement to drive the Muslims out. So this is the oldest one that survives. It was built beginning in 812, to 840. And that would be what, 11 or 12 years after the invasion of Louis the Pious. And I also mentioned previously that one of the restrictions the Muslims placed upon the Christians is you can't disturb the peace by ringing bells to call people to church services. That's not. I mean, the Muslims used a minaret to call people by human voice. Come to prayer. It's better to pray than to sleep. Charlotte knows about that because she grew up in at least a portion of her childhood was in northern Nigeria, which has many mosques. So the Muslims ruled Christians can't ring bells. They can't have public funerals because that would disturb the consciences, perhaps, of the Muslim population. And I mentioned then that bells become one of those unique features of the Spanish Christian architecture. But there were other churches, some of which Charlotte and I were pleased to be able to visit. This is San Miguel de Lilo, built in 842 by Alfonso II. By Alfonso's son, Ramiro the First. It's actually a collapsed church. It usually would have a longer nave, but apparently that portion of the church collapsed. But they still made use of it. They reconstructed it, made use of it because it was this historic importance. It's one of those that these early Asturian kings were building to sort of take hold of this leadership in providing a Christian character to the Reconquista. And that's on top of a hill looking over the city that was being constructed. And down the hill, not probably 100 yards or less, is the church of Santa Maria del Naranco, excuse me, and that was built just a few years later in 848. And it's a very unusual church. It's two-storied. It was intended not just as a place of worship, but as a place of council where other of the kingdoms in the north that were Christian were recruited to join in this effort. These Christian kingdoms weren't necessarily friends before they began this initiation. They were enemies with each other at times as well because they were political entities, not just thinking like we're all Christians, let's get along together. So in these council meetings, there was room, and the building has a regal enough appearance that it would be impressive in itself. There would be a persuasive thing. Let's get on this together. And so there's room for a council. We weren't able to get inside, but as you can see, it's two-storied, and there would be a council room as well as a place of worship. And a third section of content that we hope to cover, or what at least want to point out here, is the discovery of the remains, the bones of the Apostle St. James, which took place in 813. And that was discovered in the very northwest section of Spain. And it was, as Protestants were, kind of looking doubtfully at that kind of happening, how in the world would James? But as we pointed out early, there was early evidence that James was likely the apostle to bring one of the evangelists, but an apostle. So within the time of the apostles, before he was martyred in 44 A.D. in Jerusalem, he was, at least by some early reports, taking the gospel to Spain. Nevertheless, whether we believe it or not, it became significant at this time. And that significance was emphasized by Alfonso II, the Asturian king, to make pilgrimage. A year after it was discovered, he was the first one to make pilgrimage there, and had a church built over that tomb. Now, again, pilgrimage, some of us do make pilgrimages, I guess, but I think we have to be empathetic against our suspicions about these religious practices. We go to our Bible, and they had the Bible accessible to them because of the preaching of the word. But no one owned the Bible except for these monasteries and wealthy positions. So how do you express your faith? How are you confirmed in your faith? If you go to a place where St. James is buried, this is for real. This guy came, and here's his bones. And sometimes there were disputes over that. But nevertheless, this, in the history of the Spanish Church, this becomes a significant event. We were there in Spain in the early part of October of this past year, and my mistaken notion was that this Camino de Santiago de Compostela was along the very northern edge, as it would have been at this time. But as the Conquista moved south, more and more pilgrimage routes become opened up. So when we were in Burgos, which is sort of the middle of Spain, or well, the middle between Madrid and the Atlantic on the north coast. In Burgos, to my surprise, there was a path through the city with a shell, which is the symbol of the pilgrimage route, right there in the middle of the city. I said, "Oh my goodness, they came this far south." But that's essentially reflective of the success of the Reconquista. And as they moved south, more and more routes, because Christians from all across Europe were coming to Santiago de Compostela from northern Italy, from France, Chartres. You should know was the first stop, about 35 kilometers out of Paris was the first stop of a pilgrimage route from there. And other places, Vézelay in Burgundy was another pilgrim. Monasteries built up to support this wave of pilgrims that wanted to verify and commit their faith by seeing the actual site where St. James is
They
buried.
still do.
Yes, we saw older folks than us, and we thought, my goodness, we're being put to shame. We're getting around by bus and taxi, and they're going on their feet. And our son Andrew, actually, who is undergraduate at Gordon College, actually made a short version of that. So we come to the fourth and perhaps most significant aspects of content in the Reconquista. And I need Cluny. What is Cluny? Where is Cluny? I've tried to say a little bit, but this can be a little better introduction to the importance of Cluny as a spiritual renewal in the Benedictine rule. One of the efforts that Charlemagne made, he was trying to unify Europe into a Christian empire. And one of the things that was fighting against that unity was the fragmentation of very many different monastic orders with different emphases. And to his mind, the healthiest one was that, and perhaps the most widespread one, was the Benedictine rule, which emphasized a spiritual abbot to whom all of the monks, who was chosen for his spiritual leadership by the monks, and to whom they pledged their obedience and support. And each Benedictine monastery was independent of any other, loyal to the local abbot. In 816, Benedict of Anian. Charlotte's my correct monastery. He had been well trained in the Frankish court of Pepin, and he joined Charlemagne's army in 773 to serve on a campaign, perhaps as a spiritual advisor. But after that campaign, he resigned from the army in 773 he was convinced of the spiritual integrity of the Benedictine order, so he founded a Benedict monastery at Saint Saëns in the southwest section of France. And he really led that monastery well. When there was a council called in Aachen, which would be Charlemagne's court. When a council was called in 1816, he was one of the delegates that went there, and he proposed the idea that if the spiritual reform that he recognized the Benedict rule was capable of achieving would be better served if they had a mother church that would then found daughter churches and would answer to that mother church. Maybe move towards a more Presbyterian kind of church organization where each church does not act, or each monastery does not act independently, but they're answering on a regular basis, probably have an annual gathering where what's going on, pray for each other, but also support each other in the convictions and aspects of the spiritual renewal that they wanted to endorse. So that was the idea that was first formulated by this by Anian. It wasn't able to be implemented. And I should add that was a council when both Charlemagne and Louis the Pious shared responsibilities. And remember, why would this fighter that invaded Spain in 801, why would he call Louis the Pious? Well, he was a godly man, and perhaps even that he would be able to agree to a peace treaty allowing the Spanish to hang on to their own territory. But his piety is one of the things that he was remembered for. And so the seriousness with which Charlemagne and Louis the Pious took the concerns and exhortations of these Benedictine monks were taken seriously, but not implemented because the wherewithal, the means, was not provided until 910, when Duke William I of Aquitaine gave land in Cluny, which is in Burgundy. He's probably wealthy enough count that he had more than one estate. So he decided, because of his sympathy to the religious reform that was being intended by the Benedictine see, offered land at Cluny for them to found this mother monastery. And Cluny is strategically located close to the Seine, the Loire, the Rhone, and the Garonne rivers. Those rivers are close, within relatively close proximity, but go to all points in Spain and leading towards the rest of Europe. And so it was not just a generous gift, but it was a strategic one in terms of location. Rivers would be the highways which these guys could move. So that's the background. Here above, well, here below, you see there was a sequence. The order group, it became the spiritual cutting edge of the 11th century. And it grew so quickly that the size of the church building at Cluny had to be rebuilt 3 times by the time of 1095. So it was founded in 910. By 1095, they had torn down 2 previous, or reused 2 previous church buildings and had to build a bigger one. And that's a model of what the bigger one looked like. It was the biggest church in Christendom, and 187 meters long. 2 football fields could fit inside that church. It remained, a significant church right up until the French Revolution, and then it was torn apart for building material. And the model that you see, everything that's orange, is all that remains after the French Revolution. We went there and visited it in 2004, and this is Charlotte, and this is the remaining transept, which is the only tower of 8 that remained after the French Revolution. She is sitting, you can see their walls extend to here. She is sitting within those walls, so she's right about here. And you can see how big a scale that is. Pretty impressive. And it's pretty impressive, too, that it's sold as building material after the French Revolution. So in 1028, Sancho Mayor, the king of Navarre, so at this point already the cooperation of these various kingdoms that otherwise were at odds with each other are now cooperating. So this Sancho Mayor, Sancho the Great, the king of Navarre, sent to Odilio, the abbot at Cluny, a request that a Spanish monk resident at Cluny would be sent to become the abbot of San Juan de la Peña. And this is how he phrased that request. He speaks of his desire for a Benedictine reform realized in the spirit and under the authority of Cluny. Sancho's gratitude was expressed a year or so later in 1030, when he sent Abbot Odilio a quantity of silver taken from an expedition against the Muslims to be used in fashioning a ciborium, which would be the container in which, a very fancy container in which the communion bread would be kept. So here you see a reversal of situation previously the Muslims were taxing, as political rulers, taxing the Christians. And now the Christians are driving the Muslims out and extracting tax from the Muslims under the guise of protecting them against offense for them. Be what it may, um, it's providing money so that this resplendent church can be built. But Clooney is providing spiritual leadership for Spain. The manuscript Illumination shows the dedication in 1095 of this very large church. This is the Pope with all of his bishops, and this is Abbot Hugh with all of the monks. And this Cluniac influence continues in 1063. Sancho Mayor's son, Fernando I of Leon, that's another of these kingdoms that's getting involved. And interestingly, one family, one royal family, and another are oftentimes collaborating. In this case, it's a son who becomes the king of Leon, but in cooperation with his father, like are participating as Reconquista. In 1063, Fernando I of Leon, actually, Leon is not just a country, but it's also a city, capital city within that, sent this sum of money to Cluny, 1,000 Muslim coins, showing where the money's coming from, and 120 ounces of gold, as he's receiving this from the Muslims in his territory. And Abbot Hugh and the prayers of his monks were credited by Fernando's son, Alfonso VI, for Alfonso's liberation from the prison in Burgos, to which he had been consigned after his older brother had defeated him in a battle. So here you have two Spanish kings, brothers, fighting each other. One of them put in prison, but liberated in some sense by the Cluniac influence of prayers and also perhaps other persuasive means. So now when Alfonso the Sixth becomes the king of Castile, Leon, that territory, and conquers Toledo in 1085, Bishop Hugh of Cluny chose Bernard of Cluny, the guy who wrote the hymn that we sang at the beginning of our class, to be the key post of Archbishop of Toledo. So it's wonderful. To my mind, it's wonderful that the spiritual leadership is putting good people in place, not political appointees, but religious appointees. And as these pilgrimage routes to Santiago de Compostela are developing, and as they're developing further and further south, a lot of French pilgrims are coming, but with them are coming the latest style of church architecture from France, the Romanesque style. Again, a style that would have been reflected in part by the Cluny's importance placed upon worship. How were they a spiritual reform? They elevated the significance of worship. Odo was one of the abbots, and Charlotte points out that he was one of those instrumental in developing musical notation, because they wanted the monks in the abbey to be able to sing without having to go to Rome to learn the chants by rote. If there was notation, they wouldn't have to travel. They could do it training within their own. But the architecture was also, the beauty of the building was another importance that they placed, that worship would be grand. Again, how is this inspired by the book of Revelation? This idea that the new Jerusalem is all kinds of beauty metaphors. And I think they took that stuff seriously. And so this is the kind of architecture they brought with them. It's not like Spanish architecture. And just to reinforce that, we did look at that early church in Oviedo, Santillano, which is in the upper right. But this is San Martin de Fromista, which was actually a donation by a queen, um, Queen Munia, the wife of King Alfonso Mayor, Alfonso the Great. His wife, in her will, dated from 1066, provided money for this church to be built along the Camino del Santiago. Um, and you can see it's quite different. It does have two bell towers in the lower right. You can see two bell towers, but they're not visible because that's not the French style. And that bell tower actually was an older tradition than just when the Muslims controlled Spain. It was an old tradition. The San Juan de Banos that we looked at last week, which was dedicated in 661, when Rey Corinth, the Mozarabic, the Mozarabic king had become converted and healed. He decided to build this church to dedicate it to Saint John the Baptist. It doesn't have a bell currently, but that probably would have housed the bell. So it goes back even before the Muslims invaded the Visigoth Church, I should have said, excuse me. But these others, except for the last one on the lower right, these others were built in this period when Cluny is in a period in which the Muslims were in control, sort of defiantly saying, in the cities, you can do what you want, but in the rural areas, we're building our churches with bells so they can ring out and appeal people to come to the church service. San Pantaleon de Glosa is later than the Muslim period, but it's built over one of those remote areas in the mountains where these Hermetic monks went to get close to God. And after they died, even while they were alive, other monks came to join them to get close to God in meditation and prayer and in study of scriptures, including some that contributed to the development of the Spanish language. In these remote areas, they probably would have wanted to hark back to the old traditions, what they really appreciated. So we do find it's not an ironclad belled churches that look like this are only during this period of Muslim control. Because 1270, at that time, that would have been in the country far, far away from any Muslim domination. And the last point of Cluniac influence that I want to include here is a church that was paid for by Alfonso VI. He decided that he wanted to build a church in Lyon to celebrate San Isidore of Seville, that godly man who was instrumental in the conversion of the
Arians. An Arian.
Of the Arians. Yes. So and here's what we have recorded about Isidore of Seville as he approached his death. When his death approached in 636, having led a godly life of scholarship and leadership for the church, he gave all his possessions to meet the needs of the poor, and then made public penance, sort of setting an example. Here he's this prestigious leader, but when he dies, he's going to make a point of showing all people, all of us are sinners and need to repent. And with that kind of example that Alfonso VI wanted to support, he makes this southern doorway to this large church, which was a church that would house. It wasn't a monastic church. It was a collegiate church where lay people, a clergy that were not monks, but well-trained, would study and have influence on the urban congregation. And Lyon is one of those big cities. He wanted, this gate is called the Gate of Forgiveness. And he wanted to honor Isidore, who had shown forgiveness or shown the need of forgiveness in his penance at the end of his life. And in similar form, Alfonso wanted to honor that example. So he places himself, and I don't know where in the church this is. It's a big enough collegiate church that it's not part of this, one of this portal. But this gate of forgiveness is, I think, exemplified in Isidore, identified by name and by his regalia, his bishop's staff, and his nimbus, is next to a smaller figure who's got a sword and a shield, and that would be Alfonso VI, sort of saying that I'm honoring this guy who's greater than I am. He's, it's looking up to him. So the priority in Alfonso's mind is that spiritual leadership is more important. I'm myself humbled to look upon him as an example, and he wanted his own body to be buried in the saints. The relics of Isidore were brought from Seville and buried in this church to honor him, and with the expectation that Alfonso VI would be there. We're getting late, but just to make this a quick conclusion, this is the tympanum within that gate of forgiveness. I don't know, anybody can see what the subject is here?
You have the lamb at the top there.
We have the lamb at the top, and what's immediately beneath it?
Almost like a battle.
It's a lot of figures in chaotic motion, but look directly underneath the lamb.
Is it supposed to be Abraham's sacrifice?
Absolutely. You got it. So Abraham, so there's an axis established with the New Testament, with the Old Testament prefiguring of what Christ would do. Okay? God called Abraham to sacrifice his son, but then at the last moment spared him, which you can see on the left. The hand is meant to represent the call of God, and there's an angel providing a lamb right to the left of Abraham. So as we go out into this chaotic, almost battle-like scene, what's happening on the outer parameters? And I think you got to read it from the center out. And its easiest one would perhaps be the one on the right, which you see larger here. What's happening as we lead up to this center figure of Isaac being sacrificed? Anyone care to venture on that one? Well, I'm going to have to speed this up. That is, surprisingly enough, that's Sarah, Abraham's wife, who doesn't really figure in the narrative at all. And that would be Ishmael on the donkey going and then getting ready to be placed on the altar.
Not Ishmael, Isaac.
Isaac, excuse me, confusing. So the other side, which I'm trying to get to, would be Hagar and her son Ishmael. And the idea there is found in Paul's letter to the Galatians in 4. He speaks of Sarah being our spiritual heir or mother, and Hagar as a carnal or ungodly mother from their past. So the contrast is between Sarah and Hagar and Ishmael. And this has been written by the scholar John Williams, and he indicates, and I've copied this so you can read it at your leisure. He indicates this is the only example of sculpture specifically making reference to the current Reconquista situation. This is Ishmael with his mother, and he is made an appearance of the typical Muslim warrior. They would do hit and run attacks on horses without a bridle, so that it could be quick. And you could see that the horse is going this way while he turns around and shoots his bow and arrow. So that's the way that they attack. So it's clearly identifying this as a Muslim. and he has a Muslim cap as well. By contrast, Hagar is lifting her skirt, which is a symbol for licentiousness, and that's their implication was, as these Christian warriors conquered, they would be seduced by Muslims, for whatever reason. And that, that's a little bit of hyperbole, I suppose, but nevertheless, it's a clear example of current situation influencing decoration. I'm going to have to really, I'm already over, but with your indulgence, I'd like to just finish off very quickly. One of the beautiful monasteries that we saw was San Sebastian de Silos. Was called San Sebastian de Silos, just south of Burgos. A monk came there to reform that place. It began a renovation, which included the whole church, but also beautifully the cloister. Once he died, it was such a wonderful reform that the monastery was renamed after him, Santo Domingo de Silos. When Saint Dominic, the one who formed an order of preachers, was still in his had been barren mother's womb, she made a visit to Santo Domingo de Silos and had a dream that her what would burst out of her womb a dog who would set the world on fire. And that's a play on the word Dominicanus, the dog of God. And this is probably a story that circulated after the Dominican order was approved by Pope Honorius III in 1216. But when he did this, there were so many monastic orders, he insisted that Dominic choose some other order to adopt a rule of some other order. He chose St. Augustine significantly, who was strong in his theological emphasis. Initially, the order was not called St. Dominic, the order of the Dominicans. It was called the Order of Preachers. His concern, as a native Spaniard, Dominic wanted not to kill the Muslims on battlefield, but convert them. It's not just that we want to defeat them, we want to convert them to Christ. So that was one positive thing that came out of this. A second one, very similarly, there's a layman by the name of Peter Nolasco who had in 1218 had a vision of the heavenly Jerusalem based on the book of Revelation, in which he was inspired to found the Mercedarian order, which was intended to pay tribute to rescue Christians from imprisonment or potential death in prison. And so that order was founded, and St. Serpian was the first to be martyred. He had several ventures where monies were taken and Christian captives were released, but the last time he tried it, the money wasn't quick enough getting there, so his captors felt he had betrayed them, and he was put to death. I want to conclude. This temptation, when the church is too closely intertwined with the political powers, there's temptations in a couple directions. There's temptations to compromise Christian belief, as we saw at the beginning of this class, such as the adoptionism. At the beginning of the Reconquista, adoptionism was a temptation for false doctrine. And at the end of the class, which is difficult to hear, even before the Muslims were completely expelled, in 1478, Isabella and Ferdinand instituted the Inquisition. The Inquisition, which was originally intended to identify heretics among those who had converted from Judaism and Islam to Catholicism. The regulation of faith of newly converted Catholics was intensified to follow decrees issued in 1492 and 1502, ordering Jews and Muslims to convert to Catholicism or leave Castile or face death, resulting in hundreds of thousands of forced conversions, torture, and executions, and the persecution of converted Jews and Moors. and the mass expulsions of Jews and Muslims from Spain. So after they completely the Reconquista, Jews and Muslims were not allowed. It's clearly not in keeping with Christian behavior as it's proclaimed. So there's two temptations: false doctrine or false conduct, or leading a life that's not consistent with what God would have us do. And it's highlighted again, sort of that was the temptation we saw when Louis the Pious, the Spaniard, said, no, you can keep your kingdom there. We're glad we're Christian. Same thing happens in France in the early 19th century. After the French Revolution, where chaos and atheism creates no authority, Napoleon steps forward, putting himself with the force of the church behind him to become this new leader to end the chaos. And he plans to have himself crowned by the Pope in Notre Dame. Napoleon is so arrogant and so self-appointed that he was supposed to wait for the Pope to crown him. Instead, he took the crown from the Pope and crowned himself. A clear example that, nobody's giving me orders. I'm the one that is charging the church. And he demonstrated that in his behavior. So here we have, one of the problems, and I think I would hold up as an example or a contrast, is the way that Alfonso VI respected the spiritual leader, the way that Napoleon does the exact opposite. So I'll leave you with that. And I want to thank you